What's up, Summoners? King Blair here. With RTA Season 5 in full swing, I wanted to make an updated tier list so you guys get a good idea of what units people are using right now in RTA in order to climb and what units are good in the current meta so that you can build and try to get as high as possible in your RTA climb. Now, as always, with these tier lists, I always have to say this, things can change quite rapidly. For the last one, it was outdated in like a month. So again, there's a good chance that in 2 weeks or to a month, a lot of the units may shift around. Although for the most part, units that are good typically do tend to stay on the good side. But that's just one of the disclaimers. The other disclaimer is going to be that again, at the end of the day, this is a tier list. This is going to be opinion based. I have discussed with a lot of different players, legend players, high emperor players to decide on placing. And there was some, even then, there was some things that some of the players agreed with and some that we didn't, right? So at the end of the day, it is going to be opinion based and some people have better success with their units and see other things. All right, now that we got all those disclaimers out of the way, because I always feel like I have to do them because that's always the comments I get the most. Now let's get to the actual tier list as well as to how I set that up so you guys can get a better idea. So first, the way that it's set up and how we're going to do the video is first we'll talk about what the different brackets of the tier list mean, since this is going to be a lot having to do with functionality, right? So you guys get a better idea. Then we are going to talk about the actual units in each of the brackets. There will be places in the video you can skip if you see a unit that you're interested in and you're like, oh yeah, that unit, that's the one that I really want, right? So if you want to listen to a certain unit that you see on this list, most likely you're going to be going there to that bookmark in the video so you can skip through and hear the discussion on them. And I do suggest you hear the discussion for these. And then last, but definitely not least, the last disclaimer. This is not necessarily how we're going to be doing the video, but just something to mention is that while one unit, for example, let's say you are someone that likes to use a little bit, and I know there's a lot of people that actually use a little bit in high level. This doesn't mean that she is a bad unit, right? Same thing with some of the ones here in the fun tier. While they may work really well for you, for the majority of people, they are not going to work that well. They're not going to be as competitive, right? So just keep that in mind that it doesn't mean that they're useless. Some of them, I would say that you can't really use. Like you can't really use Curious in RTA. But again, if you really wanted to have fun, and that's what the game is all about, you can definitely do some of these units on the lower brackets, and it will help out a lot too if you have some spicy picks. But all right, with that out of the way, let's actually get to the tier list and breakdown. So first, how the bracket's going to be set up. The high priority, this is going to be, they're not necessarily units that are stronger than the meta, or even the strong in some situations. They're just the things that if you don't pick, your opponent is going to be picking, right? These are things that you typically are going to ban, you're going to pre-ban, you're going to first pick, right? These are the units that you'll often see. With Senate kind of being, and we'll talk about that in a second, potentially going down lower depending on the opponent. Then we have the meta. These are units that you are definitely going to be seeing in almost every single one of your games. You have to have responses to these units because you are going to be seeing them and they are going to be there to counter you and to beat your teams. Then we have the strong. And for the strong tier, they're not necessarily weaker than the meta. It's just they're not as popular as the meta units, right? As we see Carrot right there. Carrot, in some situations, is significantly better than someone like a Polides, right? Polides is not good everywhere, but Carrot might be, right? So the strong in the meta, they're still very, very powerful units. It's just they're not getting as much play as their meta counterparts, but that does not really indicate their strength level, right? They can still be stronger than the meta units in certain situations. Then we have the good tier. These are units that, again, they can do really good in certain situations, especially with good gear, and definitely get you some wins, and you can definitely use and have fun with. But again, they're just not getting that much use, and there are scenarios where a unit above would have probably been better. That's why they're in the good tier. Again, really, really solid, really good units that you can definitely use. They can definitely round out drafts. But again, they're strong and meta counterparts. Typically will see more play and typically will perform some jobs better than them. Then we have the viable. These are units they can definitely use for RTA, but it's just going to be a little bit harder for you to draft and actually fully utilize, right? Like they have the potential to actually work really well, but it's a little bit harder to actually get them to work. They have a few more bad matchups and they require sometimes better teams and better team compass and understanding of the game to actually use properly. Then we have Cleave. The reason why all Cleave units are on their own is because Cleave is sometimes really strong, sometimes really weak. It just really depends on the meta. Right now, Cleave is doing pretty good, but as we know, Bellion is coming out very, very soon, and she has a good chance to actually disrupt Cleave a lot, particularly the Pavel Cleave, which right now is going to be one of the stronger ones. So that's another thing that to keep in mind with the Pavel Cleave. And some of the Cleaves that, yes, there's going to be more counters to it, so Cleave will evolve in the future. And then the niche tier, it's just units that if the stars align, they can do really, really good. But for the most part, they just have too many clear weaknesses that can be abused. And it's very hard to actually get them in a situation where they're going to be there doing their job properly, which is why they're niche. And then, of course, the Outclassed. Again, you can definitely use units in this tier, but it's just something that there's a unit that does that unit's job but better, or they just don't fit into the team composition as well as another hero, right? For example, something like Destina, right? Well, she's a really good Soul Weaver and I definitely use her every once in a while. There are just other Soul Weavers that do her job but better, right, in RTA. So that's why she's in the Outclassed tier. And then, of course, the fun meme tier unit. Again, I do not recommend you use these. By all means, if you have a nasty Corvus and you want to have fun with Corvus, and you can definitely probably use them, right? And you can probably have some success with them. But for the most part, you're not going to be seeing these units a lot. You really don't have to worry about them too much popping up unless you're trying to have fun or you're finding someone that's also trying to have fun. But again, that's going to be for that one. So with that very long explanation out of the way, let's actually get to the real tier list and the discussion. And I'm going to be zooming in a little bit so you guys can be a little bit more focused. But first, we're going to be starting with the high priority. So first, Fallen Cecilia. Fallen Cecilia has been meta for as long as I can remember. I don't think she's ever had a season where she was not in the meta or high priority. The reason being is the barrier at the beginning makes her really good to stop F10, who's a meta unit, right? And it also allows you to use F10 if Violet is off the table, right? So that barrier really puts a lot of pressure, as well as her just being innately bulking, being able to put skill nullify with S3. She's just the best defensive option that you have at the start of a game, as well as just having the provoke, which a lot of people are actually starting to put effectiveness in their Fallen Cecilias to provoke things like Crow, right? And you stop Crows from being able to horse. So that provoke, the utility that she provides, the barrier, it's just sometimes a lot for the opponent to deal with. And she's just one of the safest first picks. If you're a Bruiser player, you probably want to first pick her or Amelia or one of the other ones because they just provide so much utility. On the other side, we have Maid, who by far, some people even say that she's the best unit in the game. And I completely understand why. The amount of things that she does is just incredible. She's healing your team. She is stunning the opponent potentially. She's giving you CR push if she stuns. She's cleansing. She's giving you attack buff. She's giving you revive buff, right? And it's for 3 turns. And she can also soul burn, get an extra turn, and then S3 and cleanse whatever you have if you're going against someone like a Light Angelica. So Maid Chloe just provides the most for your team, and just the amount of support is often too much for the opponent to deal with. Now, she does have some counters that you do have to watch out for, such as Landy being the biggest one, because Landy will often use all the buffs that Maid Chloe puts up and just S3 continuously and beat you that way through advantage. But again, if you're able to lock that Landy and the Maid, there's not a lot the opponent can do, right? So that's why Maid is such a good unit. She just does so much for your team, and you're able to just have such a powerful support. On the other side, we have Amelia, who again is probably one of the first picks that I see the most because I personally prevent Maid Chloe, right? So I prevent Maid Chloe, so I see a lot of Amelia. Why? Same idea as Maid Chloe. You're providing some insane amount of support that often outpaces most of your opponents. The S3 is able to full heal, or give you a really good heal, not full heal, but really good heal, cleanse, and a barrier. The S2 is giving attack buff to one ally, cleansing them of 2 debuffs, and giving them 50% CR push. It just essentially, when you pair her up with things like Stennet, Charlotte, all these really big DPSs that are meta, Landy, it just becomes too much for the opponent to actually handle. What a lot of people try to do is actually try to one-shot her out the gate or try to cleave her, but even cleavers are actually using her with, they will first pick her to take away the potential pick and then decide if they want to go Bruiser or Cleave, and then they will go more of an aggressive team. Not necessarily Cleave, but more of an aggressive team, right? With like Strasse and other aggressive type units you can use with Amelia. So that's going to be why Amelia is such a good unit, just the amount of advantage and the attack buff and the cleansing and the healing she provides. It's just, she does pretty much everything that you would want to support. And then, of course, Stennet. This is one that I would honestly consider moving down to meta, depending how the meta evolves with the AoE DPSs. But high level, Stennet becomes a high priority. Why? Because of the book. Again, Bellion coming out, Stennet's not going to have that book holding, which is going to cut her damage by a lot. But she also forces the opponent's draft, which in a draft scenario in RTA, having the opportunity to take a unit that forces a response because they have to pick AoE against you is really, really powerful. And if they don't, they have a unit that they're going to have to ban because they're just going to get eaten alive by the Spectre Tenebria. So the utility with the book, the damage that she does with the S1, S3, and the fact that she makes draft go a certain way makes her a very good priority type unit, as well as pairing up amazing with some other units on this list, like Amelia, like Maid Chloe, and can fit both into Cleave type team compositions, aggro team type compositions, and even Bruiser team compositions, right? So just that versatility of team compositions is what makes it really, really nice, as well as countering Violet, which a lot of people do struggle with. Now, with the high priority, we have the meta. Again, the meta units are not necessarily worse than the high priority. It's just that they are often not as early picked in the draft. Like, you will almost see these 4 units picked in the first 4 picks in RTA draft. But for the meta, these are units that you're going to be seeing a lot and you have to have answers for. Light Angelica being the newest one, the ability to be able to strip 2 of your buffs means that Fallen Cecilia can't actually stop her with the barrier immunity like she can for F10M. So it makes it really hard to actually respond to. She also counters AoE really, really well with the S2, giving skill nullifier, as well as having a really good matchup into Cleave type deep units, right? So the high control capabilities, the strip capabilities, and the anti-AoE makes her a very versatile unit, really good for anti-cleaving, and really good in a more aggressive team type composition because you're able to just apply so much control on the opponent that they're not able to take turns and you're just hitting them very hard. One thing a lot of players will make a mistake on is they'll put her in a team that doesn't do any damage and they will just get S1 by some of the DPSs like a Ravi and Violet. So just keep that in mind. And that is how one of the big ways to counter her is if the opponent picks her in not an aggressive draft or not in a really good booster draft that can actually outlast. Is they're just going to get S1 by the A-Ravis, the Violets, the Rems, right? And that's how you're going to be winning those fights. But again, just very oppressive, very, very powerful, really good solid pick. Strasset is going higher and higher as the season goes on. Why? He's starting to actually fit into Bruiser teams. He's not just an aggro or Cleave type unit anymore. People are building him Bruiser because he's just able to make a fight at 3v4. Against a tank matchup, just being able to take out the tank from the beginning of the game makes it incredibly difficult for the opponent to come back. And the fact that we have units like Amelia that can push him up by 50% CR makes it so you can easily get his turn advantage, even if you're not in a Cleave type or aggro type situation, because Amelia just pushes you up and you get to one shot and you get the invincibility, right? And then you even have Maid for the more tanky ones. You can just get revived, S3, kill, and you're winning the game because you're forcing a 4v3. So even though all he does is damage, he does a really good job at just killing things, right? And that's what he's really there to do. Really big pressure. A lot of people will actually be banning Strasset if they're playing very bulky. Then we have Kral, who's going to be just the most general knight that you can pick. The ability for the S2 to give defense buff, the S1 provoke comes in clutch, and then of course the S3 for what he's known for, being able to take out prior units, Charlottes, other DPSs. That's a big reason that makes Kral such a scary type unit, is that S3 and how good his matchup spread really is. So he's going to be the most generalist knight, which is why he's so good even to this day, even though he's so simple, right? And you will often see him with 29k HP. I know, crazy HP builds with still really good defense and still somehow managing over 180 speed. Then we have a Ravi, who's the most recent addition because of the buffs. And the reason why she's being so good is because her damage is just so much nicer since she can actually cycle now. There are 2 ways that people are using her. One is an anti-cleave answer, since she's very tanky and very hard to take out, as well as getting that 15% CR push when she's hit. If you give her something like a Sure Comment, she can even cut in after an opponent cleaves with a Strasset, and you come in S3 and kill something because you got that massive damage buff on your S3, which really went a long way. So the CR push and the S3 damage increase just really made her a lot scarier, and just gear overall has gotten better in the game. And before, people weren't able to build her properly, but now with Pen Set getting buffed, her S3 getting buffed, and just the meta overall getting a little bit slower, A-Ravi is really showing her muscles as just this super hard to take down Bruiser that does dummy damage with S3 and S1 that is always there to threaten or revive. On the other hand, we have Charlotte, who is going to be the blender. That's what people call her. Every single time Charlotte attacks, if she has a buff, she's going to be hitting AoE. People have some insane gear on Charlottes. I've seen Charlottes do 7 to 8k consistently on my team through Adam and Aureus, right? She's just insane amount of AoE damage, and it's just very hard to take down, right? She does have answers in terms of like using things like Luna, Rem, or even Kisa to try to take her out early, or things that can apply on buffable. But if you don't have those things and you're not able to kill her, you're taking dummy amounts of AoE damage, and by the time you get to the 3rd rotation, you're going to be dying, right? If she says 3 and you're dying, right? Most likely. So the amount of damage she does and the fact that she can pair up with things like Amelia to help her cycle faster, to get to her S3 faster, to do more AoE damage, it's often too much for the opponent to actually keep up with. and that is how you're winning. She's just one of the best DPSs, as well as just being dummy tanky because she gets self defense buff when she's hit, right? And she's a knight, right? So she has naturally high defensive stats. And then, of course, we have Fairy Tale Tenebria. I thought she was out of the meta, but honestly, people really find ways to put this unit back. The biggest thing is Fairy Tale Tenebria threatens any draft whenever FCC is not on the table or is already taken. Because Violet is often not enough to stop her whole team, and she just gives such a big turn 1 advantage to the team that if you don't have her and you let her through and she hits you with that S3, you're losing turn 1 and you're getting destroyed afterwards, as well as just getting that S2 that could potentially decrease defense. Now you're even losing units, even tanky units, because you have the S2 decrease defense. And it's particularly threatening to things like Amelia and things like Maid Chloe because she's usually built with so much effectiveness. She can completely stop their turn 1s and kill them, since Soul Weavers are typically pretty squishy, with the exception of things like Royal. So that's why Fairy Tale Tenebria is still so powerful, particularly as a late pick, right? As a 3rd, 4th, 5th pick. She just threatens the draft so much, often force bans, and if not, you're just getting provoked and losing, right? Which is why Pawn Cecilia, again, is such a nice unit to have on here. Then we have Rem, one of the newer units, as well as Amelia, who is just stupid good at countering, right? It's her counterattack capabilities that make her so scary. If you're fighting her, you're basically forced to try to focus her down, because if you don't, she's going to hit you with an AoE counter that reduces your buff duration by 1 turn, applies unbuffable, and thus a crap load of damage, right? So you do not want to be taking this damage from Rem, which is why you typically will be focusing her down and why she's such a good bruiser right now, because she's also very tanky, and with Sigurd's Scythe, she can heal, right? Typically very tanky on counter set, doing a lot of damage, hard to take out, and she is honestly the best counter to things like Charlotte, because they will proc her S2 a lot. Counters to Carrot, which is why Carrot is not seeing as much play, why she's not actually in the meta, is because Rem threatens Carrot so much, right? So just the fact that she can do this, as well as if you're going against squishier teams, if they don't kill her and she procs that, she's doing really good damage to even things like Stennin. So that's why his Rem is such a great unit. Then we have Landy, who is going to be the Tank Buster premier unit. If they have buffs, if they have tanks, and you have Landy, they're most likely losing the game. Whenever they have Maid Chloe, Landy just really threatens that draft, because you're just able to get so much advantage from your S3 pushing you up and giving you the speed buff, as well as the damage. Typically, you're going to see her on a Bruiser build, and whether on Guiding Light or on Proof of Valor or Bloodstone if she's tankier, that will depend. But regardless, she's doing dummy damage, dummy tanky, and just cycling your team out with her S3 to the point that you're just going to be losing. Then we have Polides, who is arguably the best counter unit in the game. That's why she's actually here, because there are so many non-attack skills in this game right now, and Polides just threatens all of them. Maid Chloe, Amelia, right? She threatens them. Things like Tamaruluka, Light Angelica, a lot of different cleaves if they're trying to set up with Oxlets or Flan, right? Polides is just there to threaten them, as well as she herself being a good cleave unit, because in a cleave team, she's just there to do dummy damage, stop your Sage Ball from getting CR push, even in some cases stop Arby from taking over the turn, because she's able to do that CR push cut, and just does so much damage with the S2, S3 combo if they do have an extra skill. And she's one of the reasons why Elena is not the best counter to cleave out there, because Polides cuts her and forces an S2 to trigger. That's why she's going to be so good. And Violet, who a lot of the players that I talked to mentioned that they would like to see him at strong and not meta, mainly because he has such bad matchups against things like Stene, Charlotte, and Landy, since they all are able to deal with him quite well. But the reason I put him here is because his existence alone is the reason you don't see heavy water teams, right? It's the reason why Rem can't be an early pick, because if you pick a Rem, Violet just hard counters that Rem, right? You're just forced to just sit there. So because of the pressure that she puts on draft and on the current meta, that's why Violet is here, because his existence alone is enough to make drafts go a certain type of way. But again, as far as power level, could be something that's strong, since most of what he does is dodging and countering water type units. But now we move over to the strong, starting with the one that used to be the best unit in the game before all these other units got released, which is going to be none other than Carrot. So why is Carrot not meta anymore? Why are people not just first picking her at the beginning of the game? Well, that is going to be because of the existence of Amelia and Rem. We got two extremely powerful water units with the start of the last season, who are really blocking her out, because those two units get picked very often, as well as her still having her old counters of Kisei and Crow that are just able to easily deal with her. And just overall, people are playing more defensively, and she relies on actually landing those burns and doing damage that way. She still has an incredible matchup against things like Stena and an incredible matchup into things like Landy, but she has a lot more checks in the game, making her not as high of a priority type unit. But again, in a good draft, she's still going to be destroying. She's still going to be soloing. She's still Carrot. She's still doing good damage. It'll be interesting to see how Bellion does against her, especially because Carrot does rely quite a bit on her soul to cycle her S3 better. Then we have Elena, who for the most part is mostly a counter pick to things like Carrot or to other big AoE units like Charlotte, since you're able to cut that damage, heal, and also apply invincibility. But she's a high skill unit that if you're able to utilize that invincibility properly, if you have a very good Charlotte, if you have a very good ramp, right, that you're able to actually utilize Elena to her full potential, she essentially becomes a lot for the opponent to actually deal with. Then we have none other than Rylet, who is one of my personal favorites. He is honestly underrated. People still think that Violet is a better unit than him, but in certain situations, Rylet is significantly better. The build that people are actually going for right now is the speed build, because there's all these squishy Soul Weaver type team compositions. If you're able to outspeed them, when you often are, you're pretty much one-shotting them. And that's actually what the Rylet that I use does, and I was able to climb to Emperor because of my Rylet Ross combo. Since a lot of people were not putting a lot of their knights, I was taking the Fawn Cecilia, and my Rylet would come in and snipe their Amelias, right? So that's why Speed Rylet is so good. And even against not squishy teams, a lot of the time, Speed Rylet just cycles a lot harder. There's a lot of S3 damage and can take out Bruisers in a turn or two, right? So the amount of damage they can do is very threatening and honestly still an amazing unit. Then we have Blood Moon Haste, again with Maid Chloe being so prevalent, with Ruel being more prevalent. He's just naturally become a better unit. He's always been annoying against Revive and the S3 healing, the S3 damage, the S1 strip. He's always had a very solid kit. And just the fact that he counters so many things that are meta right now have put him on the board. Then we have Crimson Armin, arguably one of the best knights in the game because of the amount of damage mitigations he provides, as well as invincibility. If you know how to use a Crimson Armin properly, the opponent is not going to have a lot of ways to know how to deal with you. On the other hand, we have Ruel, who's going to be the other reviver. The big thing with Ruel is that there are a lot of high priority DPSs. As you see, most of the meta type units are going to be DPS type units that if you're able to keep alive, they're going to be able to do their job and just steamroll through the opponent, right? She does lose to things like Fairy Tail Tenebria since they're able to take away turn 1. But a lot of times, if the opponent doesn't have the big damage to actually get past their Ruel, you're most likely going to be losing. Kisei, still an incredible one-shotter type unit that can also reset. She's a really good check into Charlotte, really good check into things like even like Rem, because you're able to strip the immunity early and you're able to reset the S3 and potentially even put her close to dying, right? Especially if you get a gap, right? If you get a gap, they're just dying. So the fact that she kind of works like a speed Rylet, where she's there to threaten squishier Bruiser type units, try to one-shot them, and if not, she gets to reset them. So still an incredibly good unit. Really, really amazing if you have a good one. DN has gone up and down a little bit. So the big thing is that you will never see DN if Emilia is open or if there is a Landy open. Because because Landy does really well against DN, and Emilia is usually the preferred option because the cycling is just so much more powerful, right? So that's usually why you don't see DN that often, even though she's still incredibly powerful. But her S3 being able to set up those buffs is still amazing, and she's still a really, really good support because of that. Here we have Ross, who a lot of people may actually put lower, but he's just so stable to my team, and I think he's very highly underrated. His S2 damage immunity is really good into a lot of these teams that have some debuffs, stray debuffs, such as things like Charlotte's attack buff or attack breaks. Cross provokes, Fallen Cecilia's provokes. He's able to actually set up those immunities, and you can actually build him with some Afres to hit himself, resist the Cross and the Fallen Cecilias that may be trying to provoke him. He's able to set up defense buff, and he's even able to strip with the S1. Honestly, an underrated knight, and with all these big S1 DPSs like Rem, like a Ravi, like Rylet, he's actually able to do a lot of work with that S2. A Tywin, we actually see a resurgence of A Tywins, again, because teams are slowing down a lot and are not being as aggressive as they used to be. A Tywin lock is still real. You build them with a lot of effectiveness to actually be able to hit things like Ruel's and Emilia's and Maid Chloe's. and you're just able to cycle that S3 once you get that first soul burn to a point where they're often not able to respond because they're slowed and stunned, right? And then you just end up cycling them with a talent and winning. So as the meta gets slower, not as many people playing immunity, he's going to be showing up a lot more to control the pace of the game. Basar, on the other hand, I honestly consider putting down lower in the good tier, and it's something that it's really sad that he's gotten this far where he is, but it's just become a thing where not a lot of people playing really heavy buffs, and if they are, like with Maid Chloe, they can just cleanse it, right? So there's so much cleansing in the game. Basar has become significantly less threatening. If you're using him, it's still primarily for that 30% CR pushback, and a lot of people are actually switching to Crown Basar to be able to stun, since stripping the buffs is not as high of a priority because it's just trying to get the CR pushback, right? That's the big thing right now, and Crown also allows you to cheese some wins by stunning. Then we have Akali, who's seeing a massive resurgence, which I'm super happy about. But the reason why is, again, teams are slower but squishier, right? With things like Amelia. And if you're able to bring 2 mages with an Akali, a Soulburn, you're killing almost anything in this game, right? And people are building Akali's like a 250, 260 speed with just dummy damage stats. And they're able to Soulburn with Akali and one-shot almost any unit in this game, no matter who they are, right? And the fact that you can do that makes her so threatening to bruiser type teams that don't have things like Guiding Light, right? You're just able to come in, one-shot their Amelia, and then they lose all advantage, right? That's why she's being so good right now in the current meta, even with all the AoE that there's out there. As long as you get 2 books on your team, and you put in Akali, you're chilling. Then we have Arbiter Builder, who's another unit that I consider actually putting lower. He's not seeing that much play. His counter build is still really good into aggro type teams and still really good for anti-cleaving. But at this one, he's mostly just an anti-cleave, anti-aggro unit. Or if you're picking the fast Arbiter Builder, he's just there to punish squishier teams, right? Which again, there's not that many of. And that's why for the most part, Arbiter Builder is not seeing the same level of play that he used to. But he's still a really solid unit, and he can still definitely see a lot of play in the meta. Then we have, on the other side, we have Last Rider Crawl, a unit that is highly underrated. I have no idea why more people don't use him. The S3 immunity stops a lot of things like a Tywin that are coming back in the meta. His S1 speed buffing does pretty good damage and just overall stops a lot of AoE. And there's a lot of AoE. Things like Rem, things like Charlotte, right? Things like even like Landy. There is a lot of AoE in the game right now that he could actually benefit to try to cycle S3 faster. So I'm really surprised he's not seeing more play. Although people like Kao, which is a really famous Twitch streamer, really, really good player, actually does use him every single time and has had incredible success with him. He's chilling in Legend right now with this Last Rider Crawl. On the other side, we have LQC. With a Ravi becoming more popular, this is more of a how do you say that? This is more of something that I think she's going to get better and better with time. But with Aravi becoming more popular, LQC, again, is seeing a rise in usage, as well as her being a really good pair with Amelia, because not only do you bring a DPS, you're also bringing an Adamant Shield type damage mitigation, making your team bulkier, right? So if you pair with something like Amelia and an attack buff, I think she has a lot of potential, especially with Fallen Cecilia and with Aravi being so popular right now. She really does threaten those type of units, which is why I think she's really underrated right now and does deserve the strong spot, although most people would actually put her at the good. On the other side, we have someone like Mercedes, who I'm still not sure how I feel about, but every time I watch her, I'm like, man, this unit looks like she can do a lot. The biggest thing that she is that she's a support damage dealer. Her S3 being able to give attack buff to everyone is really, really good in more aggressive type team compositions, as well as the potential to counter when you have attack buff and do 2S2s. It's quite a lot of damage, right? The new artifact really, really helped her out and has made her significantly more threatening in a lot of situations just because of what she can do. But for the most part, it's just really hard to draft when there's things like Charlotte that are doing her job but better, right? Especially because they both lose to the same things, so you can't really draft both of them properly. There are very few situations where Mercedes is actually better than Charlotte, which is why she's more in the strong tier, although she has a lot of potential, especially because she's only been out very, very recently. And then as far as the last one for strong, we have none other than Assassin Sid. Best unit to speed contest Cleave, right? If you have good, decent speed gear, he almost is always a force ban, right? Which is why a lot of people sometimes will even bait with slow A Sids because they're like, okay, this is probably just force a ban, right? So I'm going to put this, force a ban, and then win the game off of that force ban, right? So that's usually why he just threatens Cleave so hard, as well as having a decent matchup into things like Light Angelica, if you're actually able to one-shot them, although that's not always the case. So really, really good at punishing teams that are not really fully engaging in a full aggro or cleave draft, you're able to slap that a Sid and threaten all their DPS units, and they're usually forced to ban him. Now we get to the good, and we're going to start speeding up in this section since you don't need to know as much about the units, since you're not going to be seeing them as often as normal. So we're going to be speeding up from here until the end so you guys get a better idea. But for Tamaru Luluka, really good single target DPS, really good advantage. The big thing is if they outspeed her, she's not doing anything, and if they're not too tanky, she's also dying, right? Because her job is that initial burst with S3, trying to kill something, and then going off of that. But a lot of times, her damage is not often enough, which is why people are actually switching her off of Dignazorb into a more aggressive single target damage dealer to deal with some mid Chloe teams, right? So that's another option that you do have for your Tamaru Luluka, is to actually make her more and more aggressive so she can get that initial one shot, because that essentially is going to do her job. Then we also have Samurai Seria, which people are actually taking another look at, because the big thing is she fits really well into Cleave teams, but is also doing decent in certain Bruiser teams because of things like Rem that are guaranteed to strip if they have the Demon mode, as well as Bomb just being a very annoying mechanic, right? You're able to strip with S1, set up Bomb, and then stun them next turn. So she's starting to come up more and more, and we may even see her become more meta as time does go on. We also see the side a little bit, really good into a lot of the heavy debuff teams, which there are quite a lot now. Control is back, so Dilibet is actually becoming a lot better. Emma Kawazu, if you need to punish AoE, things like Charlotte, right? Let's say their big DPS is Charlotte. If their only real DPS is Charlotte and they AoE you trigger Inferno Kawazu, you're killing something on their team. He hard punishes AoE units because if they don't manage him properly, they are going to be losing a unit. And a lot of people don't actually know how to play around him, which is why he's such a good counter pick. Acades is a unit that Call, again, I know I mentioned him a lot. He's a Twitch streamer. For sure, check him out. It's Call 8x7, or it might be Call 7x8. I think it's Call 7x8. Check him out on Twitch. He uses Acades all the time, and you would think that this unit is the most broken thing on the planet if you actually watch them use his Acades. But the healing, the cycling, the invincibility, the cleansing, it's often a lot, and in a Bruiser versus Bruiser fight, sustain usually will win. That's why Acades is so good in the situations, and why she can actually be a lot higher if you actually know how to play her and give her really good gear. Caesar Bellona, this is one that a lot of people would disagree with, and some of the legend players agreed, some of them disagreed, but the big thing is that she's going to still be a incredibly good counter pick option. If you're picking her last, there's times that she just destroys other teams way too hard, right? If they just have too much fire, like if they pick Charlotte and Mercedes and you pick Rem and Seaside, they just lose, right? So Caesar Bellona is still a really annoying Bruiser to take down, still does dummy damage, still does a lot of decreased defense, still a really good unit. It's just usually has to be 5th pick, right? Which is often a lot harder than you think it is, because you have to draft a certain way that a last pick Seaside is not going to destroy your own draft. On the other side, we have Sage Ball, who's definitely fallen a lot. He's mostly just there for countering Cleave, although some people still like to use him for controlling Soul Weavers. I have seen a tank F-Res Sage Balls. I have seen effectiveness Sage Balls to try to control the pace of the game. But for the most part, he's a shadow of his former self. General Purgus kind of got kicked out of the meta. He used to be a lot better, but the thing about it is right now, for the most part, there's no real reason to pick General Purgus when there's Amelia and Maid Chloe, right? These two units make it so General Purgus' job is not as prevalent anymore, because all General Purgus was really doing was setting up attack buff, right? That was his real role while still giving some damage, but Maid and Amelia will often take up that slot, or even things like DN, which is why we're not seeing him as much, although he's still a really good option in a lot of situations. Celine is actually a unit that, because of her artifact being more accessible, a lot more people are trying out, and because of all the non-attack skills, same thing with Pleiades, she's potentially able to take out a unit very early in the game, so that's why a lot of people like her. Troublemaker Corset, people are experimenting a lot with the fact that he can protect one of these really heavy DPS units. If you know how to draft them well, and you have a very good tanky Troublemaker Corset, you can make certain units really hard to take down. Like think like Charlotte, right? Charlotte can be a solo DPS type unit if you pick with her and Landy, and you can make it so they can't kill her if you have your Troublemaker Corset protecting her, right? Which is why he's seeing a lot more play as well. Then we have Falconer Clury, who's fallen from grace. The big reason being, she typically needs a lot of stats. She usually doesn't have that much effectiveness. And we have all these cleansers that are meta, right? Amelia's meta, Chloe's meta, things like Royal. fast things that are meta, right? So it's one of those things that she'll often either get outsped or doesn't have enough effectiveness to actually land and doesn't really do much afterwards for the bulkier teams to be able to actually warrant her. Still really, really good in the right situations, but for the most part, she's definitely seeing a drop in usage and in terms of what she can actually do. Really good counter pick into Light Angelica if you know that you're faster than them. Also, things like Guiding Light Landy really have screwed with her. Then we have Lilius, really solid S3 to cleanse, does good damage, and the S1 is very annoying. The big reason is that she takes up the slot of a knight, right? That is the only reason you don't see her more often. She's still a really incredible knight, but you often will see one of the other knights above on this list over her because she kind of takes their slot up, although she still has a great kit and honestly can function in a lot of situations. RC Mercedes, still an incredibly annoying unit, but the fact is that there are units that don't rely on their passives as much anymore, right? Things like landing, it have Guiding Light, so you can't really reach them as reliably, and you're not, if they proc Guiding Light, you can't reach them anymore, and they're able to cycle you with S3 speed buff, right? Again, there's a lot of cleansers, right? They're cleansing the debuffs. She's not doing as much work. In the right team composition, though, against the right team, she's still going to be destroying them if they don't have many cleanses, right? But again, with all the cleanses right now in the meta, it's a little bit harder to use her, and she was already a hard unit to use, so just make her even harder. But again, can definitely succeed with all the things that she can do and just being so tanky and being able to counter. Power Witch Hysteria is a unit that right now with a lot of evasion units like Rylan and Violet, she does really good into them. And the thing that I've seen a lot of people use and use her well is actually going to be against squishier teams or even teams like with Charlotte, and you will see her be very slow, like 190, 180 speed, but tons of damage, and you just come in with a massive S3, you do a bunch of damage, you strip their buffs, and you just follow up with your other DPS and finish up the fight. Really hard unit to use though. I myself am not really good at using her, so I wish I could speak more on her, but I personally haven't had much success with her, although I know she can be really, really good, and other players have told me as well. Doris, really good Soul Weaver, really good into anti-dark, a lot of healing. The big thing is that there are other Soul Weavers that are more aggressive that are going to be seeing more play. That's the big reason, is she's taking kind of that slot. Ren, kind of an RNG type unit, but if you get the good RNG with the greater basket attack, you get the crit damage buff, you get the evasion buff. If you get those nice little buffs onto a Landy or into a Charlotte, they're going to be in trouble, right? As well as you being able to cleanse one debuff, it is really, really nice into things like Bazaar. So kind of a fun Soul Weaver that can definitely do a lot of work. I definitely think Ren is not a bad unit at all. Then we have Cowrick, kind of like a Keesim. Same idea as Keesim. They do the same functional role, but Cowrick actually able to hit Soul Weaver since he's a mage and he's able to reset them for 2 turns, potentially giving you huge advantage over things like Maid Chloe. The reason why he's not higher is, unlike Keesim, he doesn't have any self-protection aside from the stealth. And there is a lot of AoE in the meta that's going to be really easy to take him out, right? Whereas Kisa gets 2 to 3 turns, Cowrick's only getting 1 to maybe 2 turns of damage, right? And it's often not enough to actually warrant it for the gear that he needs. So that's why he often will not see play. Although if you have a really good Cowrick, he can be a menace to squishier teams or teams that don't have a lot of speed contesters or that are relying on really big skills like a Maid Chloe, right? Like those Maid, Charlotte, Landy drafts. If you're able to take a Cowrick and you reset the Maid Chloe and you can finish off with an aggressive team, you're going to be getting really good advantage. Robbie, on the other hand, still really good into really penta-tank teams because there's a lot of penta-style teams. I occasionally will pull out my Robbie. She just definitely gets outshined by a lot of the different DPSs, such as things like Charlotte, right? That just do way more AoE damage and apply way more pressure on the board. But again, still a really solid unit, right? Still really nice at countering, still really good at ramping up, really nice S3, right? I occasionally still use her for anti-tanking since she's able to sustain and do her job. But again, even things like Stena and Landy don't have the worst matchups into her, which is why she's so low on the list. And unlike a Ravi, she doesn't have the massive single target revive or the potential for just healing like crazy, right? She's not as bulky. Then we have Champion Serato, who the reason he's here is because he's mostly only going to be used against heavy debuff teams. If they have a heavy debuff team, you're picking Champion Serato. Then we have Crescent Moon Rin, who is going to be a speed contester type unit. She's able to strip, she's able to steal buffs, and she's able to stun a priority type unit. Very similar to a Sid, but for the most part, people will pick a Sid. The other thing that hurts her is that things like Light Angelica, she doesn't care about Emil Rin, and that's one of the units that you're trying to speed contest. So because Light Angelica really doesn't care about Emil Rin, that's one of the reasons she's not as high, since one of her big things that she's supposed to do is not happening. On the other side, we have Emil Cowrick, incredibly good buffs, right? Immunity and attack buff, invaluable. But the problem is, Maid Chloe is just strictly better, or even using something like Amelia, right? The thing is that if those units are taken, then there's things like Landy that are going to counter you. So he still has Maid Chloe's counters, but he's not bringing the support that Maid Chloe brings because he doesn't heal and he doesn't really do much damage, right? So he's just a walking attack buff and immunity, which often is not enough, right? That's the only reason he's in good, but he still can actually function decently. Holiday Euphine, really good into countering teams that are relying on hitting to set up, right? The new artifact for Guild Wars really fit her really nicely, and it has made her a really solid option, even against squishier type teams, because you're able to pump out so much AoE damage, you're able to burn, and you're able to dodge with the new Guild Wars artifact and get that nice little CR push to allow your team to cut in. So really good in more aggressive drafts if you're trying to also tackle some of the less tanky, bulky teams. Vivian, another hero who's not seeing as much play. She still has all her old counters, but I still think she's a really solid option for setting up attack buff and immunity. And I think immunity is still really nice. The only thing is like Light Angelica really just shuts her out way too hard, which is one of the reasons you don't see her as often anymore. As well as just she still has her old counters of carrot and setting up attack buff and immunity. If you're able to set up before the carrot, that's actually really good, but then you're also going to be losing to things like Charlotte, and you're going to be losing to things like Landy, right? So still has a lot of bad matchups, even though she has some potential really good matchups. And then we have Fighter Maya, who I'm surprised people don't play her as much because teams are kind of squishy, not doing as much damage. I think Maya could have a lot of potential as a unit for execution, and it's also because of all the like stray debuffs that are out there. The reason why people don't use her is usually because teams are typically tankier. She's not doing that big burst damage to those squishy units to set up the S3 in the extra turn, right? But still really good in the right situation. And Roana, of course, mostly there for countering Seaside, as well as countering heavy dual attack teams. There's not a lot, so she might actually go down, but just the fact that just her presence makes it so Seaside can exist, right? So just because she exists, she really cuts Seaside out of the equation, and that honestly is enough. But right, now that we're getting to the viable tier, I'm going to be moving at a dummy fast rate, so start getting ready. But yeah, we're going to be moving faster and faster as we get down this list. But now, as far as Tisern, really good AoE, but things like Violet and Ram just destroy her. Kitty Cat Clarissa, essentially just a cleanser that's also able to dual attack, but for the most part, doesn't really do much outside of that, and other units provide more support. Blaze Dingo, I actually think could be stronger. It's just he's really hard to use. And if the team is too tanky, he's not going to be able to last long enough to actually do his job of big AoE damage and healing and sustaining, right? So if they're able to A, out damage him, and B, set up into him, it's not going to do as good. But with the right DPS, he can actually be really scary since he gives them attack buff and invincibility, allowing them to take a turn. So think Rem with attack buff, or even think Asisa with attack buff. Kairon has very highly fallen from grace. Everything on the planet has a strip. Everything on the planet has some way to strip him. He's really easy to kill, and he's often not able to kill a lot of these units that are out right now. And even in the units against like a Violet, he's just going to miss, right? And then you're just kind of screwed. So because of all the really good water units, because of all the strips, Kairon has really gone down bad. But if there's no water and no strip, he can definitely be very, very scary. Moore is a unit that I still think has potential, but again, it's just usually a little bit too slow. I think that the reliable decreased defense is reason enough to actually take a look at him. But having such a bad matchup against things like Landy and against things like Charlotte, which are both incredibly meta DPSs, puts him a lot lower on the list. Moonlight Rementia, one of my personal favorites. I really like using her when I can. The big thing is that she will oftentimes miss her debuffs. She's not reliable. That's the thing that's scary. If she doesn't hit the stun on a cleanser that they're going to have, you lose the game, right? So that unreliability is the only reason she's unviable. I definitely think she's strong, but it's just not reliable enough. Alencia, a solid bruiser, but it's a little too slow, right? Compared to other bruisers higher on this list that are able to just ramp up the game out of just to a point where they're just winning. She definitely has gotten power crept in the game. I would really like to see an EE because their S1 decreased defense combo into S2 is still really cool, and the S3 increased defense buff is also very nice, but just not the same shadow she used to be. For Chu, there's just better water DPSs, there's Rem, and even in situations where Rem's not open, she loses to a lot of things like Landy, Expected Nebria, because she needs to counter to do big damage, right? If you don't have access to that, you're not going to be seeing her as much. Can actually do really good into Charlotte, though, which, again, that does give her a really nice potential, right? Since she can actually counter Charlotte, who is really, really popular, but does have not the greatest matchups against a lot of heroes, and you are relying on a layer of RNG. Armin, just a very solid knight. I definitely think more people could definitely use her. She provides damage mitigation. I think she also does give an adamant shield. Just an overall really spicy unit. Then on the other side, we have Cecilia. Again, it's just the only reason you don't see her more often. She's taking the slot of another knight. The S2 is a great debuffs, but doesn't strip first. The S3 is really nice, but again, it doesn't strip first. And the S1 is a nice decreased defense, but again, it's just often not enough, right? And that's usually why she's here, because she's taking up the slot of another knight you could have been using. Iseria, kind of a spice pick, but I definitely think she has a lot of potential with units that have big S3s to reset them and to decrease defense, with Guiding Light also being able to stick on the board longer. Again, loses to the big AoE DPS units, Charlotte, Landy, Rem. All these units are big AoE DPS units, but you can't actually counter Rems properly if you have the right setup. By having someone open, you reset someone's cooldown, you decrease defense, the Rem, and you're able to take her out afterwards. For Dizzy, we're actually seeing her a lot more. Same reason for Tywin, as teams are getting slower. Her S3 can become really critical. The only reason she's in the viable tier is because, again, cleansers are so prevalent. Maid, even Elena, right? Elena to an extent, right? And then, of course, she has her old counters that counter AoE, such as Last Rite of Crawl, Rem, also hard loses to Violet, right? So there's all these things that keep Dizzy out, but as a 5th pick option, can actually destroy the opponent. Her debuffs are still very crushing. If they have no cleansing and no hard punish to her AoEs, she can destroy a lot of units in the game, right? She doesn't really lose to Landy. She doesn't really lose to Charlotte, right? It's more of the fact of the Violets, the Last Rite Across, the forced AoE on Rems, or the cleansers that really are keeping her out. Specimen says the big reason keeping him out is he relies too much on stun. Again, similar to ML Aura, that reliance on stun makes it kind of hard for him to do his job properly, because a lot of the times the turn order won't line up like you want it, and you're not going to get that big S3. But he's decently self-sufficient. It's just the fact that a lot of things have FRS, and even if you land the stun, you'll take your turn before you're actually able to capitalize on the stun, right? So that's really what's holding him back. It's just that unreliability. DJ Basar, really good counter against a lot of debuff teams. Really good into Tywin, but for the most part, most of the debuffs are like slow, heavy debuffs. And if you're only countering the one debuff option, you're taking a lot of damage from the Charlotte, right? Because debuffers at this point are just used as supports. There's no full control teams that are solely relying on the debuffs. And he can still get easily hit by F10F for the ones that do rely on debuffs a lot, and he's not going to be able to do a lot. For Rose, big thing, Polides exist, and there's just better options for Cleave, right? That's the only really sad thing. The attack buff is still amazing. She's still really cool and tanky and can push up, but just not the same threat that she used to be, because it's just Polides exist, and she has a lot more checks to her. For Assassin Cartuja, more of a fun meme unit. It's more because you're able to cheese Cleave, and I think that's often enough to actually cheese, and it's actually a viable strategy. I actually do occasionally use Evasion Nation to counter very aggressive teams, because if they can't hit me, they can't win. And then we have Solitaria, who I think is underrated. The big thing is because she's forced to AoE, she can lose against things that she's supposed to counter like Violet, but she's really good into Seaside, really good into Rylet, and really just good overall as a pseudo-control type unit, right? But the big thing, the forced AoE really hurts against things like Rem, really hurts against things like Violet, and can actually screw you up in the long term. For Sinful Angelica, really nice buffs, can really pop off with a attack unit, and can stop a lot of healing with Maid Chloe. The thing about it, she's actually very hard to use, because you have to use her in a highly aggressive team composition, which oftentimes can backfire, because if they just ban her, the Maid Chloe is live, and you're in trouble now, because you're not going to be killing the Maid Chloe revives everyone, right? So just the amount of things that it's really hard to use her, and that's one of the reasons she's lower on the list, because there's just easier ways to counter these types of units, like using Emil Haste. For Momo, really good cleanser, but that's all she really does, is just cleanse, and heal. And things like Acades can kind of do that. Amelia kind of does more, right? So there's better support options, but if you really just need someone that's consistently cleansing and healing, can definitely do the right job. And then, of course, Tenebria, kind of the same realm as someone like Emily Araminthia, just not reliable. And the fire typing actually really kills her, right? If she was not a fire type unit, she would actually be able to hit things like Amelia more reliably, which could actually make it a lot scarier. But because she has a really good chance to miss on Amelia, if Amelia usually S2s, then you go S3, then she's just able to easily cleanse with the S3, right? So kind of sucks that she's fire typing, but I don't know what other typing you would give her to make her more viable, to actually make her a little bit scary, because she has some really good debuffs. But it's just hard to hit a lot of the cleansers, right? And cleansers are very meta right now. As far now as the cleave units, so for the cleave, we mentioned before, they can go stronger, better in the future, but may also go down with the release of Bellion. Cerise, at this point, she's not really a bruiser unit. You don't really see her in bruiser. Again, too much cleansing, right? There is too much cleansing that is meta right now, which is why you don't see Cerise as often. But in cleave teams, you still do see her because she's able to set up into things like CDOM. Closer Charles is actually a unit that people are still kind of sleeping on, and the people that know how to use Closer Charles is so scary. He really did end up becoming like a Challenger Dominio that's just harder to kill. So the fact that he kind of functions like Challenger Domi, but also gives attack buff instead of crit buff, and does dummy good damage, as well as just harder to kill, has made him a really solid cleave option. And I'm kind of excited to see how people implement him once Bellion comes out, and they can't use their traditional cleaves. Pavel right now is going to be the most powerful cleave unit, although that will likely change because of his soul reliance and the release of Bellion. But if you get two units with book, and you get a Pavel, he's going to be destroying the team, right? It's usually a force man. The very only real options that you have against them are things like soul, or being able to outspeed him, or somehow being able to tank him out with things like Maid Chloe, right? So very, very hard unit to deal with. Pairs very well with Polides, and it's just the core to a lot of cleave teams. Operator Sigrid, I really think this unit is going to see more play, again, because of Bellion, because souls are going to be basically gone. Her ability to push back, give attack buff, and one shot if they have a Fallen Cecilia are incredible. I've actually seen her be on the slower build and function more for going after your setup, right? So she is not usually the setup. She's actually becoming more of a DPS type unit, especially with things like Amelia being able to push her up. For Flan, another really solid option, although we are seeing a massive drop in Flan because people are opting just to put Light Angelica or cleave with Pavel, and a Ranger takes up that slot. So Flan, still a good cleave unit, but definitely not the same. Sid, really good speed imprint, really good single target damage. Doesn't really rely on souls because it's just to kill, right? So that's the other really nice part, is you don't really rely on souls that much, and you're able to single target cleave. I do think people are going to be using more Sid in the future to counter certain things like RB if you're not able to secure the RB for your cleave. Challenger Domini, still the staple for cleave teams, pushes up, crit buff, one shots. Oxlot, again, not seen as often, although he does bring book, because usually people opt for the Pavel cleave, and Pavel cleave is usually Cerise, Polides, Carrot / Thena, depending what the mate you want, Pavel, and then like Strasse, right? So you're not often seeing Oxlots that often anymore, since it's often more CDOM, or just not necessarily Oxlots type teams that you don't see him as often. Watcher Shuri is still incredibly good for the speed imprint, as well as just the one-shot capabilities. Again, we're gonna probably see more of him once Bellion comes out for cleavers, since they're forced to one-shot and don't have access to souls. Roaming Warrior Leo, there's actually a really fun cleave floating around, which is a control cleave, which is with him, sees Samurai Seria and Emilara, and it's a really cool control cleave, right? And control cleave actually does have some potential, but again, if they know what you're doing, you're not going to be able to get that off. But again, pretty spicy, right? So I wanted to mention him in the cleave. Elfil, another unit that I think we're going to be seeing more, again, because she doesn't have that soul reliance, right? And she's able to strip, she's able to decrease defense, and she's able to increase attack. So another unit I think we're going to be seeing more of. Still a really, really good cleave option. It's just the Pavel cleave is so good right now. Shuri, mostly for the speed imprint, right? If they're trying to outspeed you with AC, you can slap on a Shuri, and it's kind of hard for them. Luna is a unit that I actually consider putting on the actual list. I actually consider putting her up here in the strong category, or on the good category for the bruisers, but primarily you only really see her in aggro step cleave teams. And again, another unit we're going to see a lot with Bellion for cleave teams. Why? She gets an extra turn when she kills, and she's able to do big damage on the last one, right? Pretty simple. On Bruiser, really solid water damage, right? And there's a lot of really good water fire units that if you're able to actually one-shot with Luna or do really good damage with, it can be very threatening. And then, of course, we have the Vildred, again, mostly there for the speed imprint. It's just really funny to outspeed a cleaver, or someone that's trying to outspeed you with the Vildred. And then, of course, now we're going into super rapid fire mode for the niche tier. We have things like Soul. He's only really there to counter Pavel, but he's that good that I felt like I have to mention him. Yuna, who's only there for, and as I mentioned before, niche is just units that you just need the stars to align, right? For them to actually be useful. Yuna, again, counter Yuna, kind of fun. You need to counter a lot. You need to make sure they don't have things that can counter your counters. And it's just usually you're not going to get that. It's not going to happen. And you have to make sure they don't have a Violet, right? There's a lot of things you have to make sure that they don't have. So you're able to use Yuna, and you're not really doing as much aside from giving some attack buff. Ida, most of the time, she needs to control, but she doesn't strip as reliably as F10, right? It takes her too long to actually set up, but if it was a really wonky aggro control type team, she could actually be pretty spicy. Dominio, really good into full aggro teams because you're able to set up that reflect, and I've actually heard the reflect damage is pretty nice, right? Especially because you get a barrier after it. So if they don't have a stripper, and if they're playing full aggro, which again is very rare to see just full aggro, not cleave, right? And I mean full aggro, like we're talking like 3 DPSs, 1 support, and then 1 flex pick, right? And that doesn't often happen if it's not a cleave. But if it does happen, Dominio, just the reflect buff can be a lot. Even if you really need damage mitigation, I don't know why you would use him over Crimson Armin. So that he might go on the Outclass. For BBK, very, very rare for you to actually get it. They have to have a team that is not going to just blow her out of the water, right? Because she's very easily targeted since her defensive stats are not great, right? But if they don't have the greatest defensive stat and you're able to float in that 50% range, she can actually be situationally really good. Pearl Horizon, again, if you really need good control, you don't have an Tywin, I think she can be a little bit spicy. She's still a unit I want to try more of. But if you have a really good sleep type team composition or something you can actually do good damage with her, I think she can actually shine. Wanda, if they're heavily relying on Violet and Violet, the stun is just super disgusting, right? And if you have souls and you can stun even their Amelia, it can be really bad. So it really punishes if they're solely relying on evasion, like if they're doing an evasion nation type team composition. Dark Corvus, if they're pentatanking, you can still use Dark Corvus. Although most of the time people don't use pentatanks anymore, the DPSs can usually solo carry. But again, not a bad option against trying to break down some pentatank teams. Shooting Star Arcades, really solid with things like Helga. If you have a really big DPS that can hold onto the buffs and they have no strippers, it could be scary, right? But again, strips are everywhere. You're not going to be getting the cheese that you usually get with the 3-turn immortality. Too many things strip in the game right now, right? For her to actually work effectively. Wonder Silk, decent option for actually speed contesting, but just not that great. Senya, Grass Knight, really fun. It's just super unreliable. And she's really good into like really heavy water teams, but it's just unreliable damage. And a lot of times you might just pick Violet. So it's like Violet would have to be off and they have to pick a lot of water, right? Melissa, if they're mostly relying on Violet. If they're one thing that they're relying on is their Violet winning them the game and you have a Melissa, they're going to lose. Purgus, they would have to have... Purgus, I think, could actually be pretty interesting. He functions kind of like a Rem, but it's the unreliability that makes him not be as good, right? But I think he does have potential with how much AoE he can do. But if they have no AoE counters, which almost everything is, no Charlotte, which is very rare, he can actually pop off against those heavy water teams. Ray, a lot of healing, a lot of nice stuff, but there's just better cleansing of the game and better supports. Although if it's a very heavy debuff team that's water reliant, like F10, right? That's the one place you would use him is Violet is off, you're picking Ray, and they don't have other threats that can actually really scare you, then Ray is a really good option. Mui, if you have a really solid aggro control team, she can pop off and do a lot of work. Ludwig, you need to set up the invincibility, which is often really hard to do. Ken, they have to have no Landy, no Stene, no way to one-shot him, and no way to reliably control him for him to actually do his job decent. And that is very rare to do, right? It's very hard for you to get a scenario where you're not going to have a Crawl that can one-shot you, where you can have a Riley that can one-shot you, where you're not going to have a Landy, you're not going to have a Stene. It's just situations that are rarely ever going to happen, but if they do happen, he is there. Yufine, for really hard countering water units. I actually think she has some potential to one-shot certain units, because, like Rem, because of how high her damage can really be. Mursa, if you're trying to speed contest, and if you're trying to dodge an aggro team, she can't actually do a really good job at that. And then Ino, solid Soul Weaver, but just right now kind of in a weird spot because there's just better supports like Amelia and May Chloe that do her job. As far as the Outclassed, these are units that it's just there's so many other units that do their jobs, right? They just are either outclassed or it's just their job that they're supposed to do, they don't do at all. So things like Kana, she's one buff away from actually being meta, which is really weird to say because she's all the way down here. But it's just Stena does a better job, and there's just even like Mercedes, right, does better DPS than she's going to do. And there's just better fire DPSs, right? For Lilibet, there's just better things to hit evasion units. I could see her actually go up to niche. That's something that I don't have enough information. And that's for the niche and Outclass tier. I probably should have mentioned when I talked about them. They're very interchangeable, right? These two tiers, they could honestly be one tier. I honestly should have just put it one tier. But again, very hard for her to actually do her job that's hitting something and also stopping from arriving. Tywin just strictly outclassed by a lot of other things. Like, why would you need him over any other unit? Beta Lytica in a really weird spot. She really doesn't... like for cleaving, you don't really want her. Again, I am curious when Bellion comes out if we'll see her come back into the meta, right? So I could very much see Faithless Lidica pop back up and to be higher up. But right now, it's just other DPS units just do her job strictly better. And other setup units, and she takes a slot of a unit that could actually be really helping set up. Again, because Rangers don't really bring souls, right? For Lidica, again, she's just an average speed contester. Judge Kisif for AoE damage, there's so many other options. He's a very standard bruiser, and there are so many amazing bruisers in this game that he really doesn't do much. Sermia, really easily outsped, and for one-shotting, Rylet is just strictly better, or even things like Akali. Armintia is just a copium control unit. She's probably the worst unit in the game. Destina, just outclassed by every Soul Weaver that's out there. Broman, why ever use Broman when Angelica exists? Light Angelica just is a strictly better version of Broman. He just gets completely shut out. And just other control units do a better job because he's so unreliable. Baiken, there's just better setup units. Ilnov and Charles, they're more on the fact that they don't do their job at countering tanky teams properly because they have to not only counter every single turn, but also proc the second part of the counter. And even then, it's not enough, right? It's just not enough damage. Celeste, there's better speed imprints. Maya, there's better knights that can provoke. And Gunther, there's better big damage dealers for the Lilius combo. As far as the fun meme tier, I'm not going to go in depth about it. Again, as I mentioned previously, there's a lot of different heroes you can maybe make an argument for, but you're not really going to be seeing them in RTA. You're not really going to get much out of them. It's going to be very hard for you to actually use them in a proper team scenario. But that is going to be it for this tier list. Again, I want to reiterate, it's mostly opinion and usage based. I will say for the niche and the outclass, they honestly could be the same tier. And I honestly should have made them the same tier. That's a hindsight 2020. Thinking about, like, the more I actually talk about it, now that I'm actually making the video, they could definitely have maybe merged into one tier and maybe made it more cohesive, since they are basically the same power level. I don't think that this is stronger than this necessarily. But for the most part, this should give you a good idea, particularly these on top, of how good the meta is and what units are really good in the current meta. But that is going to be all I have for you guys today. I look forward to the discussions we're going to have in the comment section, and I look forward to see how Epic 7 is going to change from today onward. But that's all I got for you guys today, and I will see you next time. Peace.